we have been having till now to a more practical one. Tomorrow we will dedicate the whole morning to developing the plan of action of the Dialogue 5 actors on how to enhance the protection of refugee, migrants, and religious minorities. And the panel now that we are starting will help us reflecting on the practical aspects of this plan of action. So it will serve as an introduction to the more practical discussion that will happen tomorrow. How are we going to do it? We are going to do it by digging into the question of partnership, on how the partnership among the Dialogue 5 actors can contribute to an enhanced protection. So far, we have been focusing very much on the issue of dialogue with the first forum that has introduced the Dialogue 5 actors. But now I think the big thing that is happening with this second forum is that we are shifting from a mentality of dialogue, of bringing together people, to a mentality of working together. So what can we practically do? And this goes back also to the question that Rabbi Melchior was asking, the last question of the last panel, what can be done? And I really hope that with this panel now and the working panel tomorrow morning, we can answer Rabbi Melchior's question, but also I think this is the hottest question of this forum. What can be done by the Dialogue 5 actors to enhance partnership for the protection of these three groups? So I was supposed to be a debate challenger, and then I changed my role to the chairperson. I will be here, so next to the moderator, Liviu, who will take care of the moderation of this discussion. We have three main questions. I think I will leave it to you now, Liviu, to continue. And I welcome all the panelists, and I look forward for a very constructive and productive discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chair. We are happy because we are this afternoon in this place, and practically we can find solution, implementation. And I'm surely that each one of us would like to contribute on this, this panel. The three questions which practically have been prepared for this panel, I would like to repeat that question to remember, to be remembered by our distinguished panelists. The first question, how does partnership can contribute to enhance protection, tolerance, and respect for diversity? It's so important to respect the diversity. For that, probably we need to know each other better. The second question, how can we strengthen the cooperation among the Dialogue 5 actors, diplomats, politicians, religious leaders, educators, and civil society, which include non-governmental organizations and media, in this regard? And the last question, what is the specific role of United Nations and other regional and multilateral organizations in this regard? Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, practically there are rights, liberties, and values that belong to the patrimony of humanity as the peace and the security. Right to life, human dignity, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, and there are times, as I said, I would like to repeat that, there are times, circumstances, and people that impact our choices and perspectives. It is always necessary to have references and model of responsible individuals that are taking the mission of freedom seriously. In this regard, I would like to introduce the distinguished panelists. First of all, I would like to start with Her Excellency, Madam Aziza BAROUD, the Ambassador of Chad to the European Union, United Kingdom, and Benelux. And I can tell you that I know from many years, Her Excellency, we cooperated in the first Global Summit. In that time, she came in that first Global Summit as a religious leader, expert, the member of the Parliament of Chad. After that Global Summit, she received the call to be the ambassador of her country in Europe. We are very happy to be with us Madam Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you, Liviu. And well, this is the last panel for today. And just I would like to jump to those three questions. The way it is addressed is also it is giving me also another lecture of this of the topic of this panel number 5, which could be a link between what we said as the goal 17 of the SDGs and what we are talking about. We are talking about of enhancing the partnership between the five actor dialogues to strengthen the protection for freedom of the protection of minorities, religious minorities, and migrant, and also all those people suffering today because some groups decided to destroy this humanity that we are seeking for and we are trying to build. I can say that the dialogue exists in theory. Why I say that? This morning, El Sanusi at the panel 3, I think, mentioned the Marrakesh Declaration. The Marrakesh Declaration was not a kind of isolated declaration. After that, during 2 years, I think, we worked a lot under the supervision of my brother Adam Dieng, all around the 5 continents, to prepare a kind of action plan. That action plan, we presented it to His Excellency Guterres in New York, and we can say that we have something that we can work in and we can develop it, but we still waiting for what will be done with this action plan. In November 2017, the city of Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, hosted a very important conference, European Union and African Union. And the topic, the principal topic was around this problem of migration and what happened in Libya. And we talked about slavery at that moment, and the speeches were very hard, were very strong. After that, there is a kind of silence, a kind of, I cannot say that we are not doing nothing, but still there is a kind of a weight which is very heavy. We really need to build coherence. We need coherence and also to focus on 2 points. The one point I could say will be certainly what has been raised by Abu Nimir and even Sana around the fact of the root causes. From the moment we did not address these issues seriously, we cannot go ahead only on these consequences, because those are the consequences. We know that we are aware when we regard all those problems that the weakness of governance and also the weakness of administrative systems within certain countries give this possibility to those people, afford this opportunity to those people who are spreading hate and destroying this humanity. There are bombs here, there are also the images. And here I would like to drive the attention on the fact that those images are becoming more and more banal. Those images are becoming more and more familiar in a way that even the coming generation are sometimes not shocked. I'm a grandma of a 6-year-old child, and once she was explaining to me what happened to this little boy Syrian at the border of the Mediterranean. She was explaining to me, and I was I was shocked. I didn't want her to see the image, but she was, no, Grandma, this is a little boy, his parents are disappeared into the sea, and he is here alone, and he is died. And I was asking her, what does it mean? And she just played a kind of something like that, saying, he's died that way. And it is becoming banal, and that is the danger. Here we need really, somebody says, education and awareness, to raise awareness. Yes, this media and also the internet and all those facilities that we have and we use every day are also driving us to another side, which is very dangerous. How could we find a way to maybe use more properly this instrument that we have? And I said 2 points. The second point that I would like to raise is also the way we are talking about that issue. More and more, and we are organizing ourselves around the summit, around those kind of meeting, conferences. Do not forget that those other people also are organizing themselves. Yesterday, the image shown that this, so I don't know, president or leader of the Islamic State showed himself and talked on the media and saying that I'm here and I will keep on. They are organizing themselves. I'm talking about the Sahel. I belong to that area. And what happened is that we started having problem of those extremists within the Sahel coming from elsewhere, but having now the possibility to sit in this Sahel and continue their dark business. When countries moved on and organized themselves and tried to, with the United Nations, to counter them, they decide to create other problems. They decide to create other problems. Today in Burkina Faso, at the frontier with Ghana, we have a kind of natural park which is invested by those people, and it will be very difficult to delocalize them. Another point is also to create hatred between tribes. I said the Fulani tribes will be our next Rohingyas in the area. And this is not a kind of exaggeration. This is something which is happening. Just because of those people, we are not giving up, are creating aside issues, aside problems, and taking advantage of those kind of countries. So here again, I would like to drive the attention on the fact that we can have a summit and conference and action plan and this and that, but we should also go deeper on field and try to understand what brings all those people to that extent, and also because I belong also to the lectured area with the Boko Haram. Those people are just feeding themselves on the problems, the local problems, the poverty, the lack of governance, and all those social problems that bring them, the youth generally, the youth, to accept the offers. And here again, we have to build the coherence, into what we are doing and what we would like to do and where we would like to go. I started this activity, and Louis was saying, was talking about 2 years ago, but in 2011 with the international parliamentarian, yes, exactly, the group of international parliamentarian for freedom of belief and religion and belief. And now I just say, hell, it is 8 years. Within 8 years, what happened as positive, but also what happened as negative. And I'm sorry to see that we are driving down and down. And of course, it is not a matter of a small group here or there, but how to create this commitment, how to create this kind of integration, and to have that possibility to put together our capacities to be able to address that issue. Because what is now on the table is what could we leave as an heritage to our grandchildren, and what will be the humanity in 20 years? I am saying just 20 years. So these are the questions that I wanted to raise. Thank you to give me that opportunity.
Thank you, Excellency. Really appreciate your presentation, your speech. Practically, you have been so kind, remembering us, because it's a gap between the theory and practice for one side. For other side, we understood that we need a coherence and focus on root causes, why we are here and why happened that situation. It's necessary to go deeper. Practically not only accepting creating the theory, a good theory, and the lack of governance. That is a big issue today. We need to have a leadership, a strong leadership in every country, in the international level, in this situation, which can change something on that. And practically, I'm sure that in this way, working together, we can arrive in that place. I appreciate a lot your presentation. Thank you so much. I would like to introduce the next distinguished panelist, Archbishop Dr. Thomas SCHIRMACHER. He's director of the International Institute for Religious Freedom and the president of the International Council of International Society for Human Rights. He also serves as a World Evangelical Alliance as Associate Secretary General for Theological Concern, which represents churches with 600 million Protestant Christians. I can express to Dr. SCHIRMACHER my appreciation. At the same time, he's a co-sponsor of this global summit, and really I appreciate the Institute of Religious Freedom being a co-sponsor of this global summit, and really we are sure that we can cooperate, continue this work specifically on how can we continue this process for the peace for all the people. Its floor is yours, Excellency.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for this nice introduction. And over lunch, we already have been talking about the third summit, so we are always ahead of time. The second one has not finished yet, and but it's a topic that is of utmost important. The blast in Sri Lanka reminded me of the reality we are talking about, because we have our Asian office in Colombo, and staff of our office lost 3 children in the blast, and suddenly they are not only researchers on religious freedom, but they see this in the middle. But it also shows how complicated this world is, because what happened is that not the majority religion or the state in Sri Lanka did something to Christians, but a very small minority within a minority, so violent Muslims, a violent Muslim group within the peaceful group of Muslims in the country, went against another minority. Yeah? That shows how complicated the reality can be, that if we only speak about minorities. Now talking about the Dialogue 5 actors, I have a little bit of problem. That is my moderator, because I have to say some nice things about him, and that's probably not the best situation if he is the moderator. Nevertheless, he has pushed us all for this dialogue of the Dialogue 5 actors, and that we sitting here are from those 5 different areas of life to a main is his achievement. And I want to say very clearly that I think that for our topic, that is protecting religious minorities, ethnic minorities, minorities of all kinds, and also minorities that had to leave their countries and now are as refugees in whatever situation in other countries, it's of utmost importance. The simple thing is, if you think what happens if there is no dialogue of the Dialogue 5 actors, if they go against each other. So what happens if a state is in favor of religious freedom, of protection of minorities? And let me take my group. The leaders of the majority religion preach against it every day. I tell you, it's more or less impossible. The state will not have enough police people to go against. You only can hope that the religious leaders have no influence. So in a very non-religious country, that might still go. But if it is a religious country in which people still listen to their religious leaders, it becomes very difficult to do politics, to have a nice law on religious freedom, politicians willing to put it into practice, if major religious leaders speak against it. But of course, it's the other way around too. What does it help if religious leaders say nice things and want to live in peace together? It's very good that they do dialogue, that they work together, they assure harmony in the country. But if the state doesn't want it, if the state, as we had it in history, goes against all religions or against specific religions, yeah, again, it's still better than to do something else. But let's go to an interesting thing in your 5 actors. It's not yours, but I mean, to some extent, you put those 5 boxes there, yeah? Very interesting. He has a box for diplomats and for politicians. For normal people, that's the same. They are just political actors, yeah? But the reality, of course, is that we speak about 2 totally different people groups. One that either are related to more than one state, even if they're just an ambassador, they think in 2 states. Or if they work, say, here in the UN, they are related to a lot of other states, while the normal politician, he just is working at home in his national politics. And I see this even in our Foreign Office. Yesterday we had a meeting in our Foreign Office, and the Minister of Foreign Office is much more concentrated on national politics than his ambassadors, who are there for many years, who have their whole career there. And the interesting thing of the 5 actors is we speak different languages. So I easily can have a dialogue with all kinds of religious leaders in the world, and we have a certain language when we do not speak about one religion, but if we do dialogue. And then we can say nice things, but the politician will not know what we understand, about what we speak about. Even if we have specialists on religious freedom and we meet with specialists on human rights, you find out they have totally different languages. They speak about often the same thing in different languages. And you have to force them more or less into one room to learn to understand each other and speak in a way that what they say helps to cooperate. Yeah? And the political language of diplomacy and the political language of politicians that have to be re-elected are 2 worlds. The ones are always too nice and the others are never nice enough. No, that's a little bit joking. You understand what I mean, yeah? The ones have to be re-elected, they have to prove that there is something special, that they do something new. The others long-term want good relations and even there it's important that we want to achieve something good for religious freedom, for minorities, that they are stick together. The media people often speak a totally different. I can tell you as a religious leader, sometimes I find it very difficult to communicate to media people if then they say, oh, there are different versions of Christianity, so what different is this? Oh, you are not under the Pope. How is that possible? Yeah? And you think, yeah. Nevertheless, it would be the wrong way to say, okay, I don't understand you. So, yeah, we have to be forced together, nice ways like in this summit, to sit together, to talk together, because only together we can achieve this. Because to have protection for minorities is such a huge task that you need the whole society and everybody that has any influence to be involved. And if only one branch of society, if one of the 5 Dialogue 5 actors keeps out and shoots against this, it becomes much more complicated than if we unite. And therefore, this is a big thank you to having this kind of summit. Would be much easier if we only would invite human rights experts or only would invite this. Yeah, it's quite much more complicated what we do here, but it's a big step forward. And this is why I hope that we will not only have the second successful summit, but a third, a fourth, and we go on with the summits until we really have a protection for minorities worldwide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas SCHIRMACHER. Practically, I appreciate what you wrote in your abstract. Something practically is summarizing what you said today. For one side, we can say that there are different languages. We can speak in different language the different actors in this situation. We need to find a synergy between all the actors. You said something very interesting I'd like to underline. We should, I quote, we should be aware that enhancing the protection of religious minority of all kinds, refugees and migrants, needs more than good laws or a government which want that. We need more than laws. We need to find this synergy. And I think we are in that way to find the synergy working together. Probably it's not necessary to have another global summit if we practically realize to have peace in all the world. But for one side, still we are in this process towards the peace, the common peace for all the people. We need to work together in this direction. Thank you so much. I'd like to introduce you the next distinguished panelist, which is Dr. Kiriaki TOPIDI. Dr. Kiriaki TOPIDI is the head of culture and diversity at the European Center for Minorities Issues from Germany. She has lectured and researched extensively the area of public international laws, European laws, human rights, and comparative laws. And I can tell you, I have been appreciated by Dr. Ahmed Shaid after she participated in Madrid, the third International Conference, regarding the work, how he's doing. And I think the book which we produce, and we use the title in that book, Diplomacy and Education, something have been inspired by the presentation of Dr. Kiriaki TOPIDI. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. This is more than I deserve, I think. I am one of those academics, so you will have to bear with me if this sounds too scientific. My contribution to this discussion is probably actor-focused, but from a governance perspective. So let me take you through a few of the thoughts that occurred to me when we do socio-legal research and look at how we protect religious diversity, including for the benefit of religious minorities. So the legal challenge in regulating and promoting religious diversity in the public sphere across different countries, I think, has one common basis. It requires the development and use of mechanisms that, while engaging with the legal, political, and religious systems, recognize a base of shared values. Now, these values are useful for negotiation to take place whenever conflicts, and I refer to normative conflicts, whenever these conflicts arise. In terms of equality, this process calls for, and I quote, the ethical and political space which sets out the terms of reference for the recognition of all people's equal moral worth, their active agency, and what is required for their autonomy and development. Now, such an egalitarian trajectory, of course, does not deny the local realities, nor does it question the value of the universalistic human rights principles. Instead, and I think this is what is missing from our discussions, it deals with the more empirical dimensions of assumption and use of power. And I refer you to the quote at the back leaf of the program that you have from Gutierrez. So the use of power to defend religious identity, including, of course, within and through education. It is already clear in the Western world, as much as elsewhere, that law is no longer the exclusive prerogative of the state and its institutions. Now, this, surprisingly, is not new. It's not a novel statement. For example, ECRI's 2015 General Policy Recommendation on Combating Hate Speech recommends that states encourage both public and private institutions, such as elected bodies, political parties, educational institutions, media outlets, or cultural and religious organizations, to self-regulate. How do they do that? Through codes of conduct to fight hate speech. So what we have studied less is how non-state actors compete, coordinate, or clash with the liberal state when they engage with the protection of religious freedom. So the focus, in my opinion, therefore, seems to be shifting from the state to the lived reality of religious individuals and communities that wish to assert their religious identity. So actor-oriented approaches to the study of value conflicts on religious identity can reveal to us additional dimensions to the disputes, again, from the legal perspective. We can learn more on the use of available legal frameworks, on the symbolic but also real power dimensions as to who decides how religious diversity is protected or not. We can also learn on the role of institutions in plural legal situations. So the state and societal actors use polycentric normative systems to accommodate the claims of sub-state groups, but they use them in many ways. They use them to gain political support, to reduce or escalate the risk of religious conflict, or extend the rule of law into previously unregulated areas. So these interactions among actors and the state give us an impression of the state of what is called legal consciousness of those involved. On the one side, you will see you are aware of a supranational human rights legal framework that pushes national legislators towards a specific content for norms, such as religious freedom or equality. And on the other hand, you have the multiplicity of voices that advocate different, diverse legal and policy positions on the role and protection of religious identity in our societies. In some cases, I think it's clear that this plurality is empowering. It empowers specific groups, specific interests, to the point of sometimes forcing the state to recognize them. However, there are several negative examples of that, and one which struck me is how hate speech seems to have fostered some sort of wider consensus that certain groups do not fit in because they do not accept our values. And that, of course, has dramatic repercussions on democratic discourse. This type of multiple voices, in some sense, pushes forward the celebration of diversity, as I said, because it allows for the development of flexible and elastic identities. But we are left with the crucial question: are we all fundamentally the same in terms of legal entitlements, or are we unambiguously different and should expect that difference to be defended? If I'm to put this in clearer terms, the challenge today seems to be on how legal and governance systems respond to the religious plurality and the multiplicity of identities in our public spaces. Managing without eliminating would be a preliminary response to this difficult question, with the usual, but again, hard to define caveat that certain practices will be not considered worthy of protection if they are deemed intolerable. So, to conclude, modern state governance can therefore no longer ignore religious commitments and community affiliations, especially if we subscribe to a social justice and equality agenda. While conflicts on values, principles, and beliefs may be to a large extent unavoidable in multicultural societies, I posit that our lenses to read and understand such conflicts need adjustment. The experience of religious freedom laws is neither what is called a hegemonic myth of rights, nor is it completely autonomous, apolitical, and neutral. So uncovering the connection of law with religious identity, the value of difference, as well as the limits of the right to be different, will help us understand better how to regulate phenomena like religious hate speech. Ultimately, the main challenge in our modern, complex, multicultural world is not accepting diversity in the form of difference, but rather in dealing with a different, deeper starting point where difference is outlawed, hated, disliked, and ought to be managed in a very specific manner. So, in other words, the right to religious difference is threatened by our tendency to impose on each other the right order of things. Absolute sameness, in my opinion, and I will finish with that, appears to be a dangerous strategic default, especially in times where legal authority is shared and diffused on so many levels. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kiriaki TOPIDI, for your very, very interesting and useful presentation. Practically, we can underline the main challenges of our modern complex multicultural world is not accepting diversity in the form of difference. That is the key. But rather in dealing with a different starting point where difference is out loud hated, disliked, and how to be managed in a liberal manner. In other words, practically, you conclude very well, the right of religious difference is threatened by our tendency to impose on each other the right order of things. We don't have this right to impose no one. We need to accept the differences in respecting the dignity of every person, of every human being. I would like to invite now to introduce practically Dr. Jose-Miguel Serrano, Professor of Law to the University of Madrid, in the Complutense de Madrid. Professor Jose-Miguel Serrano is a member of the Bioethics Committee of Spain, member of the Commission of Guarantee for Research with Human Cell and Human Tissues, Carlos III Health Institute, Academic Director of the Institute of Stock Market Study of Madrid. I worked a lot with Professor Jose-Miguel Serrano, and I know him. He's a good researcher. I invite, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Freedom of speech and hate speech limits. I should like to begin by recalling the beloved Republic of Venezuela today. I want to thank in a special way to the United Nations Office of Genocide, Prevention and Responsibility to Protection, as well as to the International Association for the Defense of Religious Liberty and to Liviu Olteanu for inviting me to participate in this event. I am aware that the usual thing in legal forums is to raise the issue of freedom of speech and hate speech limits in a different, almost opposite way. There is talk of limits to freedom of speech and not limits to hate speech. But I fear that at the moment an overly broad interpretation of certain new crime poses the risk that they will be used not in the right sense to protect a minority, but in a completely new and corrupted sense to impose majority thinking. Freedom of expression is the basic freedom of the political order. It underpins freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, religious freedom. Freedom of expression is never the freedom to say what the majority thinks, except in tyrannical regimes, but is linked to the possibility of espousing minority thoughts. On the other hand, freedom of expression cannot be confused with the freedom to espouse a moral or positive thought. The law, according to a widely held opinion, should not seek the perfection of subjects in an apparently correct society. The Socratic school certainly thought this, but when this idea has been combined with the modern state, the effect is the appearance of totalitarianism. Law attempts to coordinate the relationship between imperfect beings in an imperfect society. Therefore, law, and especially criminal law, must always be governed by the principle of minimum intervention, act as a last resort. Certainly, certain expressions can be considered criminal, but in general, legal intervention is justified not in avoiding disconform or even offences, but in preventing crimes, that is, in guaranteeing the coexistence of imperfect beings. So we have a freedom of expression always threatened by the opinion of the rulers or the majority, on the one hand, and the evidence in our century that certain expressions have been directed directly to provoke the crime, with expressions such as subhumans, kulaks, cockroaches, corrupt races. Killings has been directed because the first objective of the genocide is to deprive of humanity the one who will suffer genocide. In recent weeks, we have had examples of outbursts of anger or bad behavior, for example, in social networks. On the other hand, they can be considered examples of a freedom of expressions that does not recognize the basic rules of education and that does not help good coexistence. But I personally doubt that anyone who expresses his joy at the Notre Dame de Paris fire should have a legal sanction, no matter how barbaric it may seem to us. We will never invite him to a university debate, or we will never feel friendship for him. I would like to say that, except in exceptional circumstances where expression lead directly to crime, my position is that those of us who are committed to religious freedom and coexistence must appeal to means of conviction and not to sanction or penal punishment. Those involved in religious freedom are the first to be interested in the distinction between morality and law. We also know that perfection of behavior, if at all possible for men, depends on elements superior to the mere laws of men. Of course, we also know that the use of God to foster intolerance is a gravely immoral act. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Serrano. Practically, it's right. You need to have a clear balance in understanding between the freedom of religion, freedom of expression, and the implication, which are the limits on that. We need to know exactly that each one of us, we need to express freely everything what we like, but at the same time there are some limits which like to be imposed by ourselves. We have to impose some limits sometimes when we look regarding the sentiment of the other. I'd like to introduce now the next distinguished panelist. Practically is Dr. Brett Sharps. Dr. Brett Sharps is a Dean International Center for Law and Religious Study, Reuben Clark Law School, Brigham Young University. Dr. Sharps practically has an expertise on the issue which practically is developing, is teaching today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you.
I'd like to mention something more. Dr. Brett is practically a co-sponsor together with Cole Durham of this Global Summit in behalf of his organization. Thank you so much. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Along with others, I'd like to thank Adama Dieng and Liviu Olteanu for organizing this. And we at the International Center for Law and Religion Studies are honored to be included as sponsors of this event. I have a little slide deck to show you, and this first photo is of our law school, Brigham Young University Law School. We've had the pleasure of welcoming many of you there. We have a large international symposium each year for the last 25 years during the first week of October, and I hope in the coming years many more of you will be our guests as well. Perhaps here in Geneva, it's appropriate to recall my favorite Christmas gift ever. When I was 10 years old, I opened a beautiful Swiss Army knife. It had everything, a tool for every use, and some tools I managed never even to use. It was cherished by me. It was an object of unbelievably precise and beautiful craftsmanship. Today, I'd like to share with you a few of my thoughts about a concept that I have come to think of as the Swiss Army knife of human rights. This is the idea of human dignity for everyone, everywhere. This not only was the foundational idea of international human rights, it has been the focus of an international initiative over the last year that we have been involved in, along with many of you, that culminated in the Punta del Este Declaration. This is a brochure that we've put together on the Punta del Este Declaration, and I've brought about 50 copies, and I've asked some of my colleagues to pass them out. If you're interested, maybe just gesture to them as they come by, and they'd be happy to share one with you. I'm sorry we may not have enough for everyone. Next. December 10th, 2018 marked the 70th anniversary of the universal adoption of the unanimous adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And for over a year, we've been thinking about how we as a center, with our friends and colleagues, could commemorate that anniversary in a way that would refocus, refresh, and perhaps renew human rights discourse. About a year and a half ago, Cole Durham and I had a meeting with Jan Figel, and we were discussing the need for climate change with respect to human rights and human rights discourse. And he noted that in his work as EU Special Envoy for Freedom of Religion and Belief outside the EU, human dignity was a uniquely useful concept in building bridges, starting conversations, and generating consensus. In a way, this makes sense, because if you go back to the very end of World War II, as this quote by General MacArthur at the time of the Japanese surrender in 1945 makes clear, the dignity of all human beings was the value, or one of the important values, for which the Allies had convinced people that they were fighting. And so, we began to think of human dignity as a way of focusing human rights discourse. After all, it wasn't the great powers at the end of World War II that insisted upon human rights remaining on the agenda. It was rather small countries, some not yet independent from colonial rule, and NGOs, including religious groups, that would not let human rights fall off the agenda. But as the drafting began on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with countries representing a wide variety of geographic, economic, social, religious, political outlooks, it was difficult to know where to start. There were many different ideas about what should be included. As the conversation continued, it was P.C. Chang, the delegate from China, who recalled the words in the preamble of the Charter of the United Nations, reaffirming faith in fundamental human rights and in the dignity and worth of the human person. Why not start, he said, with human dignity? And that, in a way, broke the logjam. It helped the process of identifying, specifying, and articulating human rights. After all, we find references to human dignity both in the preamble to the UDHR and in Article 1. And as we began drafting the Punta del Este Declaration, our hope was that in our time, when climate change is needed in human rights discourse, a return to this basic foundational principle can serve a similar purpose. And so over the course of the last year, we held 4 conferences focusing on the concept of human dignity, and at each conference we presented and refined a draft of what would become the Punta del Este Declaration. The first conference was in Budapest last May at Central European University, and focused on the prospect that human dignity could act as an agent for rejuvenating, reconciling, and re-energizing human rights. The next conference was at Oxford University at Christ Church, which focused on the founding figures of human rights, people like P.C. Chang, Eleanor Roosevelt, and Charles Malik, among others, as well as the many practical uses of human dignity. This is where the idea of the Swiss Army knife came up. The next conference was at BYU Law School, our 25th annual Law and Religion Symposium, which focused on the connections between human dignity and freedom of religion and belief for all people. This culminated in a conference held in Punta del Este in Uruguay in early December of last year. 40 scholars from around the world gathered and spent 2 days discussing what would become the Punta del Este Declaration. In all, there were 68 original signatories from 35 countries, representing a very large, broad variety of backgrounds and viewpoints. The brochure that we have brought and that we are sharing with you today contains this declaration. The photographs in the brochure are all by the photographer Steve McCurry. Next photo, please. He is best remembered for a beautiful photograph on a cover of a 1984 National Geographic of the Afghan girl. But what we love about these photos is that, especially when focusing on the eyes, it's impossible to miss the human dignity which is found in all of the variety of God's children. The Declaration itself has 10 short articles, and they focus on the usefulness of human dignity as a human rights concept. They focus on human dignity as the foundation, the end, and the measure of human rights, on how it is useful for generating agreement and defining and specifying other human rights. One of the things we've noticed about human dignity as a concept is that it is extremely generative. It invites people from a variety of traditions, backgrounds, and viewpoints to share their understanding of the implications of this concept. But it's also elevative. It's difficult to have a conversation about human dignity for everyone everywhere that degenerates. It tends to uplift rather than to bring down. Other articles focus on how duties and responsibilities are emphasized, the uses of human dignity as a basis for education and human rights education, as a basis for finding common ground, and as a principle that's useful in legislation. The last 3 articles focus on adjudication, resolving controversies, and responding to particularly egregious violations of human rights, as well as opportunities for improvement. As our focus is on minorities, one thing that human dignity for everyone everywhere reminds us is that, yes, our separate identities are important, but attention must also be paid to that which we all hold in common, our equal dignity and worth. Human dignity for everyone everywhere is a powerful antidote to identity politics. The brochure also includes the original signatories to the Declaration, and you will recognize some as people in this room, as well as human rights leaders and religious freedom experts from around the world. I've been thinking about the Dialogue 5 actors, and I think you'll find representatives of all of those communities, although I think our Dialogue 5 framework might need to be expanded to include what will probably be the 2 most powerful institutions that can help bring about change in this area: the media and business. If you think about how the rights agendas of minority groups, especially in the West, have been advanced over the last 20 years, the institutions arguably that have been the most powerful in advancing those agendas have been media and business. In addition to the signatories, we have a website that we have created, dignityforeveryone.org, which includes the declaration as well as translations and background material. This is an evolving and growing document. One thing we'd like to do here today is invite any of you who would be interested in becoming signatories to the Punta del Este Declaration to let us know, and we'll add you to the signatories list that is included in the website. Finally, we've been asked to focus on the practical, and here we have summarized just a few of the events that have happened to date, culminating in this meeting today, where we've tried to spread word about the Declaration on Human Dignity for Everyone Everywhere. And we also have a number of additional events that are scheduled over the coming year. As we look at these photographs by Steve McCurry, it's difficult for us not to see that we are all created in the image of God, endowed with inherent and inalienable dignity. This is the back cover of our brochure. If you could go back one slide, please. I love this photo because although it's of a man with one eye covered and the other eye distorted by a lens that is dirty and powerful, we're still drawn to his eye and still drawn to his essential human dignity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Brett Sharps, for your sharing us exactly what you are doing. Your organization, practically, you convinced us that you are doing a lot. And there are many practical ways which can be copied by others in this situation. And practically starting from the dignity, human dignity is so important today from every project which you like to have. I'd like to introduce the next panelist now. We are practically, the time I need to remember to our colleagues from these panels, 5 minutes, but if we can reduce now and 3 minutes for the others, I'm sorry, the time is very close practically to finish our meeting. We'd like to introduce now Dr. Brian Adams. Dr. Brian Adams is Director of Center for Interfaith and Cultural Dialogue from Griffith University. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Am I to do this in 3 minutes? Is that what you said? Oh, okay. Okay. All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you at this conference. It's been an intense learning experience for me, engaging with such a broad range and depth of experience and insight. Especially personally, I'd like to acknowledge my esteemed panelists with whom I'm very humbled to be considered a peer, if only for the duration of this presentation. So we've been asked to answer one of 3 questions. The one that I will be trying to answer with this presentation is the second one. How can we strengthen cooperation between dialogue actors? And broadly, this panel is tasked with presenting ways to enhance protection, not that slide yet, of religious minorities, refugees, and migrants, focusing on strengthening partnerships and cooperation of the dialogue 5 actors, so the diplomats, politicians, religious leaders, scholars, and civil society. I'd like to use my few minutes to put forward a whole-of-society framework that lays out broad drivers of hate speech and hate-motivated aggression. I don't plan on telling you something you don't know, but to present a way we can bring together what we all know, individually and in our sectors, in a forceful effort to combat hate speech and hate-motivated aggression. So there are 2 objectives in this exercise. One is to provide the means of seeing the big picture of what is a very complex issue, and in so doing, strengthen understanding and improve strategic intervention in this area. The other objective is to use this framework to map where each dialogue actor would play a role. Mapping is not meant to delineate separate spheres of responsibility and impact, but to facilitate bridge building between actors engaging with each area. because it is only through working together that we can combat the rising manifestations of intolerance and hate. And in reality, my hope with this presentation is to entice you to read my paper, in which there's much more detail can be found. So, what would a framework that draws upon the breadth of diversity in a society look like? Well, I posit that it would be structured somewhat like this, around the three contingencies that influence what I call extremization. That's the external influences, social circumstances, as well as individual agency. So external is the first area of influence, and these are those that shape and constrain people's environment, but are only minimally determined by the individual. External influences can be categorized into three areas: political, economic, and cultural religious influences. The next one is the second set of drivers, the social circumstances, which can also be divided into three areas: group identity, the network dynamics, and relative deprivation. Yes, I'm ripping right through this, but again, the details are in the paper, and we can talk about that in any question period we may have. And then finally, the third area is the individual. We can't forget the individual and their cognitive and emotional experiences as well. So that's broadly the framework. I call it Countering Community Division Framework. I would now like to map where each dialogue actor would play a role within the Countering Community Division Framework. So we'll just do this pictorially very quickly. So we have the diplomats. I see is working primarily in the external influences area. Our politicians would be working in some of the external areas, and then broadly across the social areas, those groups, networks, and the relative deprivation that we talk about. The religious leaders map a bit differently from the others, of course. The cultural and religious aspect of the external, the social, and the individual. So they're found across a range throughout this framework. Scholars, and please pardon my bias on here, play a very important role throughout the entire framework. And more on that in the paper, but in particular, they can play a key role in building bridges across the dialogue actors. And then finally, civil society actors. I see them as, and map them as being very strongly, deeply engaged with the individual and social aspects of these drivers. So, conclusions from this quick analysis and a couple questions. The final slide is a depiction of the results of this mapping exercise. So examination of this yields at least two conclusions. The first conclusion is that successful strategies to address the drivers of hate speech and hate-motivated aggression must call upon all dialogue actors. As shown, only one actor, scholars, appears in each area of the framework. However, scholarly expertise on a particular driver does not equate to deep engagement or influence within a particular area. There are other actors who are better situated to take on that role, and therefore with whom scholars should be working. The second conclusion is that there are clear overlaps in actors who have the potential to address particular drivers at all three levels. So easily seen within the external, social, and individual areas. Thus, there exists the potential to design dialogue processes with specific actors who can then shape policy for that area within the overall framework. This examination also leaves two questions in mind. And as any good academic would say, you can't have a presentation without having more questions to follow. And they're to be considered for further development of the framework. The first is one that Brett just raised, and that is, where do business leaders lie as a dialogue actor? Much like politicians and religious leaders, business leaders straddle international national divides. Like civil society and religious leaders, they have tremendous impact on the lived experiences of individuals and communities, which therefore give them space to contribute to countering these movements and ideas. And the second question is the term dialogue actor actually sufficient for what we're trying to achieve in that space? Or should we use a term that indicates a more proactive role or leadership in dialogue? So not simply be actors in dialogue, but dialogue promoters, dialogue leaders, something along those lines. And I thank you again for your attentiveness, your attention, and this time that I get to be with you. Thank you very much.
Practically, I think it's not necessarily another conclusion, because practically have been very well prepared and very structured in this situation. I appreciate, and congratulations for that. Practically, if I can say something regarding what you expressed, is how each can contribute to cohesive, two-pronged strategy to fortify minorities and other vulnerable communities. That is the issue. That is, how can we do for this category of the people? If we are talking only, but not arriving to get some conclusion, some tools, using some tools specifically is not enough. We need to continue on that. Thank you so much. I'd like to introduce the next distinguished panelist, Professor Dr. Alexei Kosemiakov. Professor Kosemiakov, he worked as a dean, practically as a deep organization in the Council of Europe. He has a very strong experience in that, but today he's visiting professor in Moscow State University. The floor is yours.
Does it work?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I understand that I have even less than 5 minutes for presentation. Well, I will do it in, as I said, old-fashioned telegraphic style, by bullet points. So first of all, you asked for the practical advices. I have three to provide to the audience. The first is in my former capacity of director of the Department of Anti-Discrimination in the Council of Europe, which always comprise three main elements, three main conventions of the Council of Europe protecting minorities, religious minorities, anti-discrimination of all kinds, etc. This is three elements are: the first is the European Convention on National Minority, sorry. The second is the European Charter for Regional and Minority Languages. And the third is ECRI, mentioned already, which should be translated European Commission against racism and intolerance. So all three elements are used through 47 states, except two first, which are used only by the states which ratified these conventions. My point is here, with my 20 years experience in Strasbourg, this convention should be properly used by the country and by the NGOs, by the religious group, by minorities group, by all kinds of social groups which are concerned by these three biggest instruments. Again, I do it very shortly. It's not always well known, but even not properly used by many participants in European countries. And the particular feature of these conventions are they are not simply signed and ratified. They are the follow-up mechanism. With different regularity, but there are follow-up mechanisms which provide the interaction process between the social groups and the minority national religious group concerned and these three mechanisms. So this is my first point. The second point is a lot has been said about educational process. But education do not stop on whatever, school education, etc. University education is also very important, I would say even a more promising part of this, because it's dealing with adult people which is already more or less educated. For example, myself, I introduced the elements from the Council of Europe conventions and of AIDLR activities in my lectures. It's very simple. It's very simple. You are free in, you have the minimum program, etc., but you are free in introducing elements which you consider important and useful to be done. It's, I advise this to be probably also used by others who are dealing with scholars, professions. The third is more publicity. Well, I am planning to write the article about this event in Russian, whatever I found as a magazine or news editing. This is especially because this audience is not very crowded by Russian people. In previous time, I started to be from the first summit with you. I was in my international public servant capacity. Now I came as Russian independent expert and a university visiting professor. Well, this is to say that we also should be more proactive. There are hundreds of people involved. Why not to do it in our personal capacity, using our status, our position in our national, whatever education system. Well, since I changed my casquette, I am now speaking in my capacity of visiting professor, and besides, I'm also the chair of the scientific board of the not so big NGO in St. Petersburg named Institute of Human Society. Institute of Human Society, it's called. Why I think it's important to mention this? I'm listening, I have the privilege to listen all who have spoken before me these 2 days. I realized that the discussion was focused more on the issues religious minority and all others, including society, including authorities. What is absolutely true, we need these elements, we need these tools to protect better and more religious minority, as well as other kind of social groups which are in a dramatic position. But what we need also is to understand what our societies are and where we are moving. That's why I would like to bring your attention, by the way, in the same room, some 5 years ago, it was a big international meeting of Green Cross International. I was participating, still in my official capacity. The Secretary General of the Global Forum, you know, the NGO organization, Secretariat of Switzerland, by the way, who said, listen, we are firstly in our history probably in the situation when we don't know what kind of future we are willing to build, what kind of society we are dreaming for. By Rabbi Melchior proposal to start dreaming more. And this is exactly what we need, because there are things, basic elements which are missing. I bring also your attention to the last Global Forum report of November 2018. Go on, remember those who read. It's clear from this report that our world is not in the best shape today, even worse. It is approaching a very difficult period, even critical or dramatically period of enormous crisis. To my mind, the issues we are discussing here also should be inspired by this kind of idea, which is targeting the whole society. I'm back to the work of my NGO, the Institute of Human Society. First of all, there are no common image of the future of the world. We do not have this picture of the world, which we can say it. And if there are pictures, there are different pictures. Like we don't have the unified form of understanding the world and its future. We have the forms which are different by different civilizations, by different religions. But what is common for all religions, that's why we have the best position for dialogue. This is the understanding of humans, the human nature of religious, and its focusing on human identity is the very promising and unique form, unique basis for our dialogue and further discussion. By the way, the Greek word of dialogue means and provide this, the participant must be in equal position, and perceive each other as equal to all parts of the participants here. Well, that's why, so I stop here because probably I don't have more time to develop. We are at your disposal in my new capacity, even with this NGO, but still bringing the ideas about what kind of human society we could dream, where all religions, of course, because the fighting against other believers, other religions, it's clearly, it's abnormal. It's abnormal situation which cannot be borne, even less in the difficult future which is promised by the Rome clubs or other world thinkers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you, Dr. Alexei Kosmiakov. Practically, you demonstrated that it's possible to put in practice something what you learn, and that the scholar can learn from others. That you include it in your curriculum in the university, that means it's something which can each one learn from each other. That means it's so important today. Thank you so much for your presentation. I would like to introduce now the next group slot of panelists for 3 minutes. 3 minutes. I'm sure that we'll get the results in 3 minutes to express their ideas. Dr. Ganum Diop is Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty to the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventist Church. Dr. Ganum Diop is the Secretary General of International Religious Liberty Association. It's one of the oldest organizations practically have been created in 1893, if I is correctly. Dr. Ganum Diop, more that he works to foster mutual understanding between Christian faith tradition and other world religious and philosophy. He's Secretary of Conference, Secretary General of Christian World Communions, the largest Christian organization to foster peaceful inter-church relations. Dr. Ganum Diop, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Olteanu. I would like to start with a question that I asked during my previous presentation. Why does it have to take wars, atrocities, horrors of wars and genocide to prompt human consciousness to come up with landmark declarations? And I mentioned the Edict of Serdica, etc., until even the UDHR. And what could add, I mentioned also the treaty, other treaties. All the these significant historical documents are preceded by times of bewildering brutality and destruction of human lives. And these, of course, are rooted also on the legitimization of violence against human beings. I would like to commend His Excellency, Mr. Adama Dieng, for leading the Office for the Prevention of Genocide. This is not a reactionary endeavor, but rather a proactive attention and recording of signs which may lead to atrocity crimes and genocides. So deconstructing their root causes and debunking rather their logic of faith is, their logic of death rather, is paramount. It is true that the office was established after the tragic events of Srebrenica and also the Rwandan genocide. That is true, but its proactive mandate makes it an indispensable office for the promotion of life and the prevention of death. This summit is not a reaction to terrorist attacks or end murderous actions. Its mandate has become deeply relevant for the building of a better world. Today, this proactive mandate is the ground for the second global summit, and Dr. Liviu Olteanu researched, initiated, and wrote about the dialogue of 5 actors integrated in the framework of this summit. Now, this summit is exploring actions, not just plans of actions, but concrete actions, purpose to achieve objectives and reach goals to make this world a better place for migrants, refugees, displaced persons, persons in vulnerable situations, religious and non-religious minorities. So, congratulations to the panelists for highlighting the need to enhance protection of minorities, refugees, and migrants and displaced persons. But why should the rights of minorities, refugees, displaced persons be protected, as the title of this summit intimates? I believe it is fundamentally what Dr. Brett SCHARFFS just reminded us, because of human dignity. That is the ground for all human rights. Now, whether from a religious or non-religious perspective, there is a consensus, actually an overlapping consensus from philosophers and religious thinkers, that human dignity is actually the ground through which we should consider every human being as a person with infinite value, to be respected and, of course, protected. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ganun Diop, for the short but very precisely presentation. And you practically underlined the needs of practical actions. We need to get the practical actions together. And we appreciate working together on this project, because this Global Summit, as you expressed, is not as a result because the terrorist attack happened, because we like to be proactive. How can preventive? We need to have the preventive diplomacy, and how can work together as scholars, each one of us, all 5 categories, because together we can contribute for a better world. Thank you so much. I'd like to introduce now the next distinguished panelist. Practically is Dr. Marie Juel Peterson, Senior Researcher, Danish Institute for Human Rights. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So coming from a human rights perspective, I would like to direct attention to a difficult, but I think nonetheless important aspect that I think we haven't really touched upon today. So I'd like to ask panelists, when we work to protect religious minorities, refugees and migrants, how do we ensure due attention to both collective and individual aspects of the right to freedom of religion or belief? Because I think there has been a tendency in some work around religious minorities to focus primarily on the collective aspects of freedom of religion or belief. And as important as collective rights are, freedom of religion or belief is also a right of the individual to be free from discrimination and oppression. And the minority perspective means that we sometimes risk missing out on this. Violations of religious freedom sometimes take place within a religious group, whether it is a minority or a majority group. Religious communities sometimes engage in discriminatory and oppressive practices against women and LGBTI people. Even persecuted religious minorities may be highly patriarchal, with values and traditions that run counter to principles of equality, inclusion and non-discrimination. So that means that religious minority women and LGBTI people are often victims of double discrimination. Freedom of religion or belief also ensures the right of individuals to interpret and practice their religion as they want, even when this runs counter to the orthodoxy of the religious group or community of which they are a part, whether this is a religious majority or a minority. And minority perspective risks overlooking the rights of those who go against the mainstream interpretations and practices of their group, the minorities within the minority. And people who interpret their religion in a different way than the rest of the community, people who do not practice their religion, people who change their religion or leave their religion, they are often victims of discrimination, harassment, or even persecution, also within religious minority groups. And in fact, internal dissidents may even be harder in a religious minority context, given the external pressure that this group is often facing and the need to stick together. At the same time, however, we also have to be acutely aware that discourses on human rights, in particular around women and LGBTI rights, are also sometimes used to stigmatize religious minorities. We have right-wing populist movements sometimes employing gender equality and anti-discrimination discourses with the ill-concealed intention of stoking collective resentment against unwelcome religious minorities, as Heiner Bielefeld has said. So my question is, how do we ensure an approach to religious minority protection that includes due attention to individual rights, equality and non-discrimination in a manner that is sensitive to the particular situation and vulnerabilities of religious minorities? Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. You have been very short but very clear in this presentation. Practically, you said it's necessary, it's a relation sometimes we are interpreting religion or practicing the religion. It's a difference between them. Practically, we have a confusion sometimes. We like to say to others what to do instead to look myself what I'm doing in this situation. Thank you. I would like to invite now Professor Antoni Eduard Nistor. Antoni Nistor has been worked many years in the humanitarian work as a president of Provivere Dignum Foundation. He's an expert practically. He gets expertise regarding communication, international affairs, and in a practical way, he can express what can be done regarding Dialogue 5. Professor Antoni Eduard Nistor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I will try to be as short as possible. I would like to speak without reading, but because of the jet lag and the shortness of time we have, I will be as fast as possible reading, but also being as relevant as possible. Mr. Livio Olteanu mentioned my pragmatic mindset and view. In the last several years, I focused more on working with the corporate environment as a strategic and executive advisor or consultant. And I really appreciate Mr. Brian Adams. He mentioned something that I would suggest for the next summits, probably on this Dialogue 5, to include the business segment, the business sector of the society, because they are the engine of our society. And they are building our society, basically. And my first remark regarding the topic has to do with this, what Dialogue 5 framework can actively do to involve more in that battle against hate speech and extremism. And my first remark comes to answer a little bit something that was just has been marginally mentioned during this summit. I'm sorry I didn't have your name, Brazil mission. Sir, you mentioned before about what do we do for tackling with internet and social networks. We have to understand that the advantages and the dangers of living in the internet era. I'm not seeing, or I'm seeing very little of the millennials here, a few number of the millennials. We don't have people in their 20s and 30s, and I think we should have more of them here. And there is a fact, most of our youth today spend more time in the virtual world than in the real world. We know that many of the perpetrators of terrorist attacks have been radicalized by social networks and by internet content. And many other people are continuously being manipulated through fake news and populist agendas. So this phenomenon becomes more and more present because of what we call today, and please pay attention, the filter bubble. The filter bubble. Filter bubbles are created when an internet content provider like Facebook, Google, Twitter is narrowing their feeds in a way that is tailored to the user's needs and likes. If you are conservative, I will explain that. If you are conservative, you will receive more and more of the conservative news, posts, friends, and other content. If you are a Christian, will be delivered mostly Christian content. You will barely or never see Muslim content. If I am black, I will receive very little to nothing of the content targeted to white people, and so on. That encapsulates the people in their own world and prevent them from interacting with different ideas or viewpoints. What can the Dialogue 5 actors and the participants to this summit do to counter this phenomenon? I have two suggestions. One of them, make laws and market regulations to require service providers to serve non-biased content and non-targeted content to their customers when it comes about news, opinions, and posts. They can keep doing it for commercial products and services, but not for news and not for posts and for opinions. A second way to fight this filter bubble is to educate the users in two ways. One, to confuse or distract the artificial intelligence algorithms by manifesting a greater and unrelated variety of interests. So don't stay only on one interest or one or two, three interests, because the artificial intelligence algorithms will learn that and will target you always with the same type of content. So do it as variated as possible, your searches, your interest on internet. And the second way we need to educate the people to search on internet and to interact with the internet is always access several sources, including those of your opposite ideology, and try to understand their point of view. They need to get exposed to opinions that are distinct from their own. And if they are still in their filter bubble, they will not get exposed to those ideas. My second remark is a little bit less technical, and it's short, is about a more subtle form of harmful speech, which actually sets the premises for the hate speech. This is the dividing speech of politics and religions. Us, they, ours, theirs. The rulers, the opposition. Black and white, right and left, the elected ones and the apostates. This fosters competitions in detriment to cooperation and inclusion. We shouldn't stand women against men, pro-life activists against pro-abortion activists, pro-Brexit against non-Brexit militants, Muslims against Christians or Christians against Muslims, blacks against whites or vice versa. We shouldn't have political parties fighting against each other, but a big family thinking together and finding the best solution to all. Stop thinking as parties and start doing it as a whole. To do that, we need to think and create different political and religious mindset and models. Don't foster division by your speech. Don't try to win supporters by seeding division. If we seed division, we'll harvest hate. And if we feed the hate, the consequences will be unrest, strife, wars, and destruction. And I'm ending, help people understand that the others are human. Basically, a human being like themselves with basically the same needs, same pains and joys. Build bridges, build trust and unity. We are all a family. We are all parts of the great body of the humanity. We are one. We need to sit down and deliberate what is good for us as a whole nation, as a united Europe, what is good for us as a world, what is good for us as planet Earth. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your proposal, for your suggestion. I would like to introduce now the next panelist, Dr. Gregorio Bettiza, lecturer in international relations at the University of Exeter. Practically, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm very conscious that I'm the last one of the final panel of this day, and we all, I think, need a break, probably. So I'll be very brief. First, I want to thank everybody for the organizers for inviting us and putting together this event. And I'll make two quick remarks. The first one really tries to answer the third question posed for this panel. What is the specific role of the United Nations and other regional and multilateral organizations in this regard? And I think it has a very important role. I just finished a book looking at practices of religious engagement in the context of states' foreign policies, and in particular in the US. And the book is coming out this summer with Oxford University Press, and one of the findings of the book is basically then when states engage with religion in the context of the US, it's in terms of religious freedom, faith-based development, countering violent extremism, interfaith dialogues, and so on. So there are a variety of activities. They will tend to do it according to their national interest and their values, and they will seek those kind of actors. And earlier we heard, in fact, Imam Razawi mentioned this explicitly. Religious leaders, he says, he finds in certain corridors aligned with interest of a particular country. That's why multilateral forum, I think, could be a very important space for these kind of activities that are happening out there in the world, rather than at the state level. Second remark, though, and both remarks really involve what's happening in this room more than what's happening out there in the world. And the second remark is more of a sort of a critical injunction, and of course, being an academic, we always like to criticize, and so I cannot do violence to my nature. And the critique is this, and it's not really, it's not a destructive critique, is we've heard in these days a lot of talk about hate. Hate doing stuff, right? Excluding, violence, generating refugees, migrants, and so on. But who does this hate? And we've heard a lot of different actors, far-right movements, populists, religious fundamentalists or extremists, dictators, authoritarians, and it hasn't been mentioned that much, but I suspect that quite a few in this audience might think also some quite progressive LGBT activists, feminists, and so on. So who is doing this hate? And what does it do? Is it violent? Is it non-violent? Does it discriminate? Not discriminate, exclude, not exclude, and so on? And most importantly, especially if we want to find solution, what drives it? And again, we've heard a plethora of answers to this question. I think, of course, everybody comes with their perspective, but maybe some sense of what really sort of should be the main drivers. I'm not asking for a theory of hate here, that would be too much, but a sort of an explanation, some of the main drivers, right, and of who is doing it. And again, we've heard evil as such, which, why not? Economic inequalities, I haven't heard of that at all, and that's really odd. Diversity to some extent, global dislocations, authoritarian regimes, exclusivist ideologies, we've heard quite a bit about that. Ignorance, we've heard quite a lot, and some pointers towards religious establishment, right? So this establishment of religion, or if you have state and religion too closely tied together. So, of course, depending on what we understand, who does hate and what drives it, then we will come up with different solutions. And I think part of the frustration that we've heard in these yesterday and today about there's a lot of talk, but there's not clear guidance of what should be done, I think comes from this general confusion of the sense of who does what, where, and how, and why. And so the solution becomes education. If it's ignorance, maybe avoid dislocations if it's about diversity and migration, and so on. But so and here's, again, the academic. So a clearer sense of who does what, where, and why, and how, I think might be a fruitful way to think about solutions as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Betizza, for your short presentation, but very clearly expressed in this situation. You did the best, and we appreciate a lot. I'd like to conclude from my side what said, and I'd like to quote Mr. Adama Dieng, His Excellency. He wrote and he said some years ago, and I'd like to repeat now, I quote, "Peace and justice are the foundation on which all the societies must be built if we are to achieve sustainable development, respect for human rights and the rule of law. Sustainability is our passport for the future." I like this expression, our passport for the future. The principle of respect of diversity, respect for the differences between people, including their beliefs, is fundamental to the development of stable and peaceful society. I thank you so much for all the panelists for your presentation. And like the last conclusion to the Mr. Chair.
Yeah, no, I just will say we see you tomorrow here. Tomorrow is going to be, as I say, a very important day because finally we'll be focused on practical recommendations for the plan of action that we'll build together. So we really hope to see you here tomorrow, and we look forward to a very constructive discussion and building together of the plan of action. So go home now and rest well, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye.